各位听众朋友大家好，欢迎收听这一集的军事相对论，我是向正维。相信在过去一周呢，大家最关注的新闻，不管是国内还是国外，都很关心的就是蔡总统在过境美国洛杉矶的时候，跟众议院议长麦卡锡 Kevin McCarthy 见面。这个会面为什么很重要？因为众议院议长在美国政坛的排序高居第三，也就是说当美国总统出意外的时候，他们有一个接班的顺序。第一个当然是副总统，那接下来呢就是众议院的议长。其实他们原本是希望这场会面呢能够在台湾举办，麦卡锡也希望能够比较去年前议长裴洛西来台的模式跟蔡总统见面。但是当年裴洛西来台之后，我相信大家都印象深刻，就是中国举行了一场96台海危机以来最大的对台军事演习，那就是担心这种不理性而且破坏区域和平的举动再次上演。这次我方的国安单位好几次跟美方还有跟麦卡锡办公室讨论之后，才决定要把这个会面移师到麦卡锡的选区，也就是洛杉矶见面，希望不要让中国有借题发挥的机会。不过我一直说集权国家是不可信的，你也很难跟他讲道理，因为不管台湾做什么事情，中国都会不高兴。就在蔡总统7号返抵台湾之后呢，中国解放军随即在8号到10号发动了一个名称非常长的演习，叫做台湾海峡、台湾北部、南部、东部空域组织环台战备警巡跟联合利剑演习。那一直到我录音的这个时间点呢，根据国防部的统计，光是在4月8号这一天，解放军就出动了71个架次，越界中线跟西南空域45次。在9号这天出动了70架次，那其中有35架次逾越台海中线，还有进入了西南跟东南的防空识别区。这机种也很多元哦，包括了战斗机苏凯30、歼10、歼11、歼15、歼16，好长一串名单。然后还有轰炸机轰 6K、空中加油机运油20、运输机运8、运9跟空警500。简单来说就是包括了战斗机、轰炸机、空中加油机、运输机跟空中巡逻机都出动了。在海上部分也有11艘的中国舰艇，那据了解呢，我方大概也有10艘左右的军舰在海峡中线跟解放军对峙。虽然这次整体来说解放军的演习比上次裴洛西来台之后的那场演习还要短，那上次是9天，这次是3天，但我们要注意的是，解放军每次演习的讯号就是更努力的更强化包围跟封锁台湾，这也是美方最担心的事情。为什么会这样说？因为前阵子我刚好有机会去了一趟美国华府参加研讨会，那我也有机会跟包括国务院参议院还有4个智库来讨论交换意见。先以结论而言我发现不论是行政部门还是立法单位、民间智库，都有一个共同的忧虑，就是台海安全。而且我有个更深的感受，就是说美方对于台湾能否成功阻止中国进犯，他们是有疑虑的，但这不代表说美国要放弃台湾，而是美方正透过不同的层面帮助台湾强化安全。所以接下来呢，我会分享一些我跟智库对话的内容，让大家更了解美方的想法跟立场。那首先我要介绍的智库叫做 Global Taiwan Institute， 叫做全球台湾研究中心，简称 GTI， 这是华府专门研究台湾的智库。那我要先跟这个副执行长 John Dotson聊聊 GTI 在华府的工作有哪些。Hi John, nice to be here. First of all, could you tell what role does GTI play in Washington, D.C.?
And I think the role of GTI, again, I think as we see it, is to better inform policy discussions about Taiwan, because a great many people, well, in America, and the rest of the world, don't necessarily know that much about Taiwan. They will hear it mentioned in the news, often in the context of tensions with China or threats made against Taiwan. And I think many people might have sort of a vague sense of, okay, there's some kind of problem or conflict between China and Taiwan, but why is that? And that, and I think in the general public, people may not know that much about it. So I think we see our role as trying to better inform those discussions through the research that we perform and the publications that we release, such as the Global Taiwan Brief, an online publication that we put out every 2 weeks, and through public policy discussion seminars that we have, very similar to what many other think tanks do.
确实我想台湾的大家都有个误解，就是以为世界各国都很了解台湾，尤其以为美国很了解台湾，但其实不然过去美国政界对台湾的印象大多是中国议题下面的一个子议题，那一直到近期近5年，那美中对抗变得更强烈之后，才有更多人主动去了解台湾议题。So for people in Washington D.C., what issues about Taiwan interest you the most?Fairly
or unfairly, I think probably the issue area that gets the most attention would be the security dynamics that surround Taiwan. We've seen over the last, I would say 2 to 3 years especially, quite a significant increase in cross-strait tensions, both in terms of the hostile rhetoric that the government of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, directs against Taiwan, and with the coercive military pressure.that the PRC has also directed against Taiwan. And I would say that probably gets more attention than anything else.
But you just said not so many people know much about Taiwan. Then, now, why Taiwan matters?
Well, for a number of reasons. I think there are many people who would look at the tensions between Taiwan and China and say, well, why should people in America really care? It's very far away. That doesn't affect my daily life. Why should I care?My view would be that the security of Taiwan is very important on 2 levels. The first argument to be made is the moral one. There is a long tradition in U.S. foreign policy, the Wilsonian tradition coming out of World War I, that it should be a legitimate role for the United States to try to promote democracy.And the spread of liberal democracy and of freedom around the world.
OK， 所以第一个重点是比较形而上的，就是美国要宣扬自由民主，这也是美国为什么这么希望台湾维持我们的自由民主。Please continue. What is the second level?
This island of 23 million people is being threatened by one of the world's most oppressive, authoritarian, and I would argue totalitarian governments. And I think we have a moral imperative to support Taiwan.Just as I believe we have a moral imperative to support Ukraine in defending itself against Russian aggression. I would say that's the first argument. Now, if you want to contrast that with a more realist argument, to say, why do we care about any of those things? How are U.S. interests at stake? I also think they're very much at stake in the tensions that surround Taiwan. And again, with the threats being made against Taiwan by the PRC.And I think to appreciate that, we have to consider the counterfactual, by which I mean, what would the world look like? Well, what would the Asia-Pacific region look like? And then what would the world, in a broader sense, look like if the PRC undertook a forcible annexation of a military conquest of Taiwan, and America just stood back and did nothing about it?What would that do with our other security relationships, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Japan, with all the other countries in the world that have security arrangements with the United States? The promises that we've made and the security relationships we have with those states would be revealed to be hollow.
我相信世界各国，那美国的盟友都在看美国如何维持它在国际上维系世界秩序的角色。对我而言呢，我是从乌俄战争来分析，因为在过去几年美军相继从伊拉克、阿富汗撤军，而乌俄战争期间，美军也没有派遣军队到乌克兰，但是他们提供相当足够的反制的武器。好一段时间美军奉行了一个政策，叫做 No Boots on the Ground。这是否有代表说，如果台海爆发危机的时候，美军也会以同样的方式，就是只提供弹药来守护台湾？这也让我想到说，日前国防部长邱国正他提到，台美正讨论把美军的弹药库移放到台湾来。So what is the meaning of the U.S. intention to stockpile weapons in Taiwan?
My own view would be that's a very important step to take for Taiwan's security. If, God forbid, I certainly hope there's no sort of military conflict around Taiwan. Anyone who would want a war is crazy. But it's a real concern for the future. And there are a range of potential coercive military options that the PRC could direct against Taiwan. ranging from what it's doing now with what are often termed gray zone operations directed against or to direct pressure against Taiwan, going through possibly a blockade, a naval blockade, and then all the way to a full-scale invasion. Taiwan is obviously, it's an island, right? And it's very dependent upon maritime trade. And Taiwan is not self-sufficient in energy resources, for example, and relies very much on imports of energy, food, so forth. And in the event of a military conflict, we would also have to add the need for weapons, for military supplies, material. From my own very limited experience, I was in the U.S. Navy during what was termed Operation Allied Force in 1999. That was the bombing campaign that was directed against Serbia as a result of, or caused by, what the Yugoslav government was doing in the Kosovo region. We learned very quickly just how fast you can go through stockpiles of weapons and other military materials. In a modern high-intensity conflict, you can expect to expend munitions and other military supplies very quickly. Mm-hmm. That it would be a very important step to stockpile a lot of those materials in Taiwan now to the maximum extent possible. And not just out of concern for a conflict, but I think the better that Taiwan is prepared to defend itself, the more deterrent value that will have. Because I think we need to do everything we can to send the message to the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party that attacking Taiwan would be really, really hard and could well fail. And that therefore they will be far more hesitant to consider that as one of their options. Along with other steps that we also need to be taking in military terms, such as closer staff-to-staff coordination between the U.S. military and perhaps other allies, and with Taiwan's military and Taiwan's government officials. I think it's not just hardware that's important, but software. And those connections and relationships are very important as well.
I'm curious, are those weapons for the Taiwanese military only, or we can expect some U.S. troops in Taiwan?
I'm going to be hesitant about getting into presumptions on what the U.S. government might do in those terms. Mm-hmm. So I can't really speak to that. I think I'll just give the general comment that, again, God forbid, if there is any sort of military conflict, you need to be as logistically prepared for it as you possibly can be beforehand. But again, in terms of contingencies or what exactly the U.S. government might do, I'm going to stay away from speculating about that.
It's all right, it's all right. 其实我跟其他单位聊到这个问题，到底美国会不会出兵，这牵涉到美国总统的决策。而台湾也跟美国在这个议题上有许多讨论。但目前我了解的是比较着重在分工，也就是美国它可能会打击中国的船只，帮助台湾突破封锁，但是主战场还是要我们台湾自己打。另外，也因为乌俄战争还没打完，美国持续支援武器给乌克兰，已经间接影响到售台武器的时程，所以美方希望台湾能够同时透过其他的方法强化自我防卫，这也是为什么蔡政府要把役期从现在的4个月恢复为1年。但我相信大家还是很好奇，因为坊间有各种讨论，中国可能会在2027到2035年之间攻击台湾。我接下来想请另外一个研究印太的智库 Project 2049的研究员 Eric 来跟我们聊聊美方究竟是怎么看。Eric, how do you evaluate the Taiwan Strait situation? And do you believe PLA will invade Taiwan in 2027?
This was specifically about capabilities, that China would have the capability to attack Taiwan, not about intent. When we look at threats, it's comprised of your capability and intent. Mm-hmm. And by 2027, his assessment is that, Admiral Davidson's assessment is that China would have the capability to attack Taiwan. Intention is a separate issue, but at the same time, if you have that capability, it could change at any time. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party has a timeline for action regarding Taiwan. Rather, it has milestones to be prepared to act if necessary. When we talk about the defense of Taiwan, there are things that Taiwan can and should do to defend itself. Taiwan is not going to be the attacker. When you broaden the aperture and there's China and the United States, China would be the aggressor and the United States could come in and could intervene if necessary, right? President Biden has mentioned multiple times that the US would. However, the Taiwan Relations Act, which is the TRA, which is the bedrock of US-Taiwan relations, does not explicitly state that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense, but rather to maintain the capacity to defend Taiwan if necessary and to provide arms and services of a defensive character to Taiwan. So outside of that, there are a few factors that would I guess, cause China to attack or the United States to defend. And it's not just the intention of the Chinese Communist Party. What are the global issues happening? What is the domestic situation within China? And I think these are the factors that go into it. So it's not as easy as saying, 2027 to 2035, it's go time. What's going on in the world and how's China's economy doing? What is the political structure and what are the political developments in China, the United States, and Taiwan.
所以简单来说，重点还是中国领导人的意念。问题不在于中国什么时候具备攻台的能力，而是什么时候想要发动攻击，或者是不会发动攻击。这牵涉到两岸关系、世界局势，还有乃至于我们自己的备战准备。
And come 2024, there's going to be election in the United States and Taiwan, which could change the dynamics in the Taiwan Strait. So I think Taiwan's defense is an urgent issue. It could happen tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, 10 years, or never. And it's also important to define what an attack is, right? So in DC, a large part of the conversation is on the invasion scenario, an amphibious invasion that requires the Chinese military to cross the Taiwan Strait. That may or may not happen. And I think it's important to recognize that. So there's a lot of research that needs to go into studying not just the invasion scenario, but other scenarios on the peace war spectrum that will require Taiwan's defense.
听完这集呢，希望大家对于美方如何分析、评估台海局势都有更多的收获。而我之后呢，也会就台美的外交关系，还有美国与中俄的两极对抗，再次分享我在华府的收获跟观察。也请大家继续支持与分享军事相对论。再次感谢您的收听，我是向正伟，我们下一集再见，拜拜。